also think that just that's part of why I wanted to be a musician. I really wanted to make connections. And I think that that is what leads people to it. It's just sometimes we get on the road and then we're trying so hard to be good that we forget why we got on that road in the first place.
What a treat to have today's guest on the podcast. I've known her for years, over a decade, I think, and this is far overdue, this conversation. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations. We are talking today with Mary Javian, who has such an interesting career. In addition to being a great bassist, she is the chair of career studies at the Curtis Institute of Music. She went to school there, actually, and we talk about how this role evolved, what Curtis was offering in terms of career development when she was a student, and what they're doing now, and how people can engage in their community and how important that is in today's day and age. We, of course, talk a bit about the pandemic. How could we not? Because we're both stuck at home dealing with that. And we talk a little bit at the very beginning about the Iris Orchestra in Memphis, Tennessee. Mary and I have both played there for years. And yeah, this is just a great conversation. I want to let you know before we get rolling here about this incredible event. You may have heard of it, especially if you listen to the podcast, the International Online Bass Summit. It's happening June 24th through the 28th. And we have 70, I think, clinicians at this point. We're into the hundreds in terms of participants. So I would love to see you there. I will be there. I've been organizing it with Barry Green, and it's just such a cool event. So you can learn more at basssummit.org. And I want to let you know about one of the sponsors for this event. It's Kolstein Music. Manny Alvarez has taken over the Kolstein shop recently, but Barry Kolstein is still making basses and rosin, of course, and all the great things that Kolstein is known for. They have a performance space that they are kind of turning into something to deal with the pandemic, to let people check out instruments and the like. Kolstein has been in the business longer than just about anybody I can think of, and they're continuing to innovate. I find them so inspiring, and they're so supportive of bass events, whether it's the International Society of Bassists, which, by the way, this Bass Summit is a benefit for the ISB, or just in so many ways, he's been a great friend of the podcast and supporter of the podcast, and he's one of the sponsors for the Bass Summit. So check them out at Kolstein.com, and I'd love to see you at the Bass Summit. All right, here we go. Oh, and by the way, before I get rolling, Mary Javian is also going to be a clinician at the Bass Summit. So if you're listening to this, you'd love to hear her talk more about this topic on that platform. Okay, here we go with our conversation with Mary Javian. Oh, you did? Oh, and so they had that concert.
We had that concert.
Okay.
And I remember when I was there talking to my husband, and he's like, yeah, this is your last trip. And I'm like, no, it's not. And, I'm like, I'll be home for a while, but it'll be okay by May, which is when I was supposed to go to El Salvador. And he's like, honey, you're not going to El Salvador. And like, we weren't concerned at Iris when we were there. We were hugging. We were. Mm-hmm. I remember one of the violinists talking about this Mahler Chamber Orchestra tour, and she was really excited to go, and she was really scared it was going to get canceled because it was, a European orchestra coming over. And I remember thinking, I was like, yeah, it probably is going to get canceled.
Yeah.
But, and then when my Curtis students got called for the same tour, but later, and one of the bassonists couldn't go. And so she was so excited. I'm like, that's great. You're probably not going. Not wanting to be. So it was just funny how everybody just like kind of realized what was going on in stages.
Yeah.
So Iris was my last concert.
Okay.
Yeah, I was sitting with Tim Pitts. So It was a great last concert to have. Not last concert ever, but last concert for a while.
Last concert for a while. Yeah, what a difference a month makes. Because I was coming back from Pittsburgh right around then. I think I came back on like March 2nd or something like that. And there was not really concern. I mean, I think that was when maybe California had a couple cases pop up or something like that, but it was still not. And then, 1 week later, San Francisco Symphony is going to still play, but to an empty hall, and then no more playing, and then no more playing anywhere, and then here, no more leaving your house, which I know is now like pretty, I'm assuming that's what's happening in Philadelphia area too. Are you all sheltered in place, or? We
are. Okay. And actually it's funny, while I was in Memphis, I was talking to Christy Edmonds, who's the head of artistic for the San Francisco Symphony. Mm-hmm. And we had this meeting scheduled on the phone, and then she had to change it because they had an emergency tour meeting because San Fran was supposed to go to Europe.
Yep.
And so she was dealing with that. So I was actually talking to a lot of, kind of artistic programming leaders at that time. And they were all in various phases of trying to get ahead of this. So that's part of how I knew. I think from the player perspective was behind, obviously if you're in the upper levels of management, scheduling concerts, they were a bit ahead of, I think, where the musicians and the players were thinking.
What's been interesting, being on, I'm very tangentially involved in the education program for San Francisco Symphony. That's my local middle school I go into and coach once a week. But a lot, they employ about 30 musicians that do that sort of work. Many of them, that's probably the bulk of their income. And so we had a meeting, like last week, I think maybe, with the head of the education department. And it was, this is a bad time for everybody. Their response, I think, has been pretty excellent considering the circumstances. But it's crazy to talk to. I guess it's affecting everybody everywhere. Even my wife's a radiologist, and she is still fully employed. That looks like that is, like academic radiology is probably going to sail through. But the University of California, where she works, they just instituted a hiring freeze into June 2021. So even in medicine, which you would think like these people who are fellows are scrambling, thinking, am I going to, having a job was not a question you were going to be thinking about 6 weeks ago. But it's pretty crazy.
Oh man. Yeah. I was actually teaching a class for the Penn Med School. Mm-hmm. And it was meant for first year med students. So those guys will be okay. But then a lot of the fourth years were the TAs and were helping me design the course. And so they missed their day where they kind of figure out where their fellowships are. It's very complicated, but and I believe, and I have to get in touch with them again, but some of the fourth years are getting kind of called up.
Yeah.
To help out, even if they haven't really been practicing, although you are sort of practicing by your fourth year.
What an interesting, I didn't even think about that. Yeah, the match. This is a process that probably like 1% of the people that listen to this would understand what that is, but it's a totally crazy, so I didn't even think about I didn't even think about what that would be like. Yeah, and it's interesting reading the news about how some, people still in training, in various capacities are being called up. My wife goes, so UC San Francisco is kind of the belly of the beast for this coronavirus pandemic. That when the Grand Princess, this cruise ship that had so many people infected, they went to the Air Force Base, but then they were taken to where she works. So so it's pretty interesting. Even go back 3 weeks ago, and it looked like a disaster movie, with tents and people running around, and so it's pretty crazy.
Oh my gosh. Well, I'm glad she's okay, and that she has her job, and that you guys are pretty much out of risk, right? She's not dealing with COVID patients on a daily basis.
Right. Her work sort of continues as like cancer patients still need treatment. People still need, life still has to go on, to some extent. So yeah, I mean, but boy, does it make you think you're safe. You think you're doing something and then just talk about the rug being pulled out from under you. I was just chatting with Steve Bailey, who runs the bass department at Berkeley, and Madeline Crouch. Actually, we were chatting a couple days ago just about what the future looks like, just in academia. And it's pretty, I mean, nobody knows. These are new conversations, but it's been pretty, it'll be interesting to see. It's interesting times for sure. How are things at Curtis, and with what you do? What's going on right now?
Well, the faculty at Curtis, we've been working on our online teaching. And it's a challenge. Our students are all over the world. About 40% of our students are international. Many of our Asian students had to go into quarantine when they went back home for 2 weeks. So a lot of them are just getting out of quarantine now. And if they were going back to mainland China, they were taken straight to a hotel room where they had to be by themselves for 2 weeks. So one of our pianists who I've been working with created a really great vlog of the journey back to China and her time there, and then she doesn't have a piano. So she's just studying scores and, they're not supposed to leave the room. So people have to come deliver them food. So it's really been for the faculty, I think a lot of us just trying to reach out and stay in touch with the students, which is a challenge. The students in Hong Kong, have to wear bracelets on their arm for 2 weeks to make sure that they're okay. So, our violin teacher, Ida Kavafian, is talking about to violinists, like, do I wear it on this arm or do I wear it on this arm? Like, I don't know. You kind of need both of them. And Hal Robinson and I've been in touch about platforms and what works best. I mean, my classes are project-based work in community. So really what I teach is social entrepreneurship and how to create value that both socially and artistically. So obviously a really challenging thing to do in this environment. I mean, all of our projects were sort of about making connections with people and communities, and a lot of them disadvantaged communities. So in Philadelphia, the statistics are around 56% of the students on average don't have access to internet, and really won't start up their online learning until April 20th. So the students there have gone over a month with no school. And so the district is trying to get Chromebooks out to kids. Comcast is trying to get internet access, but some huge hurdles. So for us as arts partners and trying to add value in this scenario, we're trying to create online residencies and be in touch with people that way. We have a project with the Penn Memory Center, which is for Alzheimer's patients and their caregivers. We were doing songwriting and composition with them. And so many of these projects were about the interactions. We were sharing stories with one another and then creating pieces around those stories. We actually are going to continue it online. We're going to set up some Zoom meetings. Not everybody is as good with technology. And there's some generational aspects to that. I'm really worried about that population just because of the isolation. This is very unusual time where people are like scared to visit their older relatives. And so people are more alone than normally they would be in any sort of crisis like this. So I feel like that project's especially important to continue, but definitely a challenge. I mean, I'm asking students to make videos that are personal and just from their homes that are beautiful pieces of music that they can give a personal introduction to. We're also doing instructional videos, like everything from this is how you hold a violin to, hey, this is the bassoon. It's awesome. Maybe you want to consider playing it someday. So then the question, once we have the content, is how to get it out. So I say Curtis as a school is trying to, stay engaged with all of its constituents, but it's really different trying to communicate with, your fans or your classical music insiders versus people for which that's not their normal kind of music. Actually, funny enough, the group that knew us the best when we started our work were the guys in our prison project. So we taught a class in a maximum security prison. One of my grad students did, and we've been there for about 3 years. And when we first went in, they actually knew us better than anyone because we're on the public radio, not the radio, the public TV station, WHYY, airs Curtis recitals. So
really?
when we came in,
wow,
you're from Curtis. And they knew certain people. I had this harpist from France that they had seen before, and she brought her harp into the prison. She was like a rock star when she came. They'd all seen her on TV. So, and we have no access to the guys now besides that show. Prisons are particularly challenged right now. The guys are in lockdown 23 hours a day. They can't leave their cells. And of course, it's really hard to control the virus when people are that close together. So, it's really challenging, but you have to find ways to reach out. And so it's been for me just about every day trying to connect with some new students or students that I haven't talked to lately. And, trying to reach out to friends that I'm thinking about. One of my friends was just furloughed from Chicago Civic, and she's a cancer patient, and her insurance is going to end the end of June. So major times for the arts on all sides of the aisle. I'm hoping that part of what this does is that musicians and management board, all the different facets of arts organizations, learn to come together and not see each other as the enemy, because the more we can kind of protect our institutions and work together on it and innovate through this, that's how we're going to survive and move forward.
Yeah, it's great to hear you finding some silver lining in all this. That's something I've been struggling with, and then I get dark, and then I feel better. Then I listen to the news, and then but I mean, the work that you do, boy. 6 months from now, a year from now, when we can start coming together again, I can't, how appreciative everybody's going to feel when you get some of those community interactions, right? When you actually get back on stage and play that first concert. Can you imagine how that's going to feel? And I was talking with Susan Cahill a few days ago, and she Colorado Symphony, and she was saying that she's really been focusing on some of her smaller group projects. Not that she's doing anything in person right now, but she said her thought is, well, we're probably going to want to have music soon, but maybe not in large groups. So she's sort of like seeing maybe that some of these first, we will be able to get out there, but maybe we're going to be in groups of 10, not maybe groups of 2,500, for a little while longer. Hopefully sooner rather than later, but it's made me think.
Right. Well, and in some ways, another silver lining is, I think, even as a performer, when you're preparing, like I was working with a bass player who's at the McDuffie Center right now, and he's getting ready for his grad recital, which is now going to be recorded. And I think it's a potential time to think about who your audience is and developing something for them in a very personal way. Mm-hmm. And part of the problem with performance has been, well, I'm going to spend all my energy coming up with like the perfect concert of all the music I love, and I will just play it perfectly. And then whoever happens to be out there will like it. And we'll know if they liked it based on how much they clapped or what they told me afterwards. And I think we have to really look at all of that. I think that, some of the frustration I see in the industry is, well, now I have to go find people to listen to my perfect concert. But if you flip it around and really start thinking of, say, even one individual that happens to be on the screen in front of you in this moment, and you're going to play for them, and you're going to play that piece, whether it's Bottesini or any work, you're going to play it for them in a way that engages them, and that may also include some talking. It may include some interacting. Maybe it's just how you choose the repertoire, but it's not in a vacuum. It's really for someone. Mm-hmm. And I think when we start developing work around the people we're playing for, it kind of flips it. It's no longer like, oh, let me find that audience. It's like it was for them in the first place. Mm-hmm. So this time could be spent, developing those skills so that when we can go back, we can go one at a time. We can play just for an individual to begin with. I mean, I've thought about, I'm in the country right now and just doing like a porch concert where I take my bass out, on the porch and play a couple of pieces. And if somebody's like walking their dog, they'll hear it and stop, or otherwise I'll just be playing for the horses. But, I don't know, maybe I'll like come up with a program that the horses will particularly like. But, it can't just be about our own fulfillment. It has to be, who are you playing for?
I love that image of you playing out there in the country for the horses. It's funny here. I'm probably in the opposite sort of scenario than you, because I'm in downtown San Francisco, like North Beach, San Francisco, which is a kind of a creepy place right now with nobody on the streets. But there's one guy who I see every few days walking down the street playing the accordion, playing "What a Wonderful World."
Oh my God! Are you kidding?
I am not kidding. He walks right by my place. I'm like, A, that's very San Francisco, and B, that really made my day. And my wife and I were sitting out the other day, and we heard it in the distance, and we thought, is he going to come down our street? But then he must have gone another way. But so we're seeing a little bit of musical cheer. But porch concerts, yeah, I love it.
Well, I have a friend who's in France who has been doing stairwell concerts. He's an oboist. And so he just opens up, he's in a building, he opens up the door to his apartment and stands in the stairwell and plays. He does it every day. And if someone listens, great. If not, no one's complained yet. He's a really wonderful oboist.
So something I know they've been doing across the U.S. at least is at 7 p.m. clapping for the healthcare workers. And we hear that. We go out on our balcony and we hear like, they're like, sort of like coming from different areas of the neighborhood. So that's another, it's cool to see those unifying things. Or you may have checked out Italians singing from the balcony, so, yeah.
Yeah, the Curtis students put together a video of America the Beautiful. Dedicated to the healthcare workers.
Cool.
And it's about 20 students playing from their living room. And then one of our conducting fellows kind of put it all together. And it's really, really nice. Just goes to show, you don't have to pick your most virtuosic piece. Like, it was really developed in mind for those people, for the healthcare workers. And it's lovely. It's a really nice transcription.
It's interesting. If people hear the name Curtis Institute, a lot of people, they might think, like elite music school. It's people like shedding like they might not realize that, and which I know it is, but they might not realize that what you do there is a major component of it. What is if you were doing the elevator pitch of your role at Curtis? Maybe not during the pandemic, but like what's your role at Curtis, and actually maybe how'd you fall into this? How'd this end up being a part of what you do?
So I'm chair of career studies at Curtis, and we have 3 arms of our academic curriculum: liberal arts, musical studies, and career studies. So when I was a student at Curtis, we didn't have career studies. That's the new part. Career studies is an overall umbrella for courses that help you apply your musicianship to life in the real world outside of school. So we have courses in pedagogy, music and technology, and I teach our art assistant curriculum, which is project-based learning in communities, and also a class that's more of an ideas incubator where students can have their own project they want to pursue, and we help them with that. And I think that I started doing it. Actually, Joe Conyers and I were involved in the very beginning, and Stanford Thompson, we wanted to bring people to Philadelphia for a fellowship idea we had. And so we approached Curtis for rooms in the dormitory, and the dorm was full, and so they couldn't accommodate that. But they did say, well, how would you teach people how to do this kind of work? And we said, well, you can't do it in a classroom. People just have to get out there and try things and get outside of the school in order to have new experiences and try things out. And sometimes you fail. And that's something that was very antithetical to classical music training, certainly when I was in school. Not that my teachers were pushing perfection, but that's our idea of what we were trying to attain. And of course, that's a very protected sort of atmosphere. Once you get outside of the bubble and start playing for people that have never, experienced a live performance, it really calls into question, what is the most important thing about what you're doing, and what are you trying to convey? And those kinds of questions are more important than sort of the hard skills. And so I think that there was a lot of fear going into developing the curriculum, where we started with this idea of a checklist, well, what does everyone have to know? And when they asked me to come and help lead these efforts, I said to the committee that I think the checklist is important, but things like, how to write a resume or how to build a website, those students will figure that out, or we can help them figure out when they're ready, but they're not the most important thing. Like, the most important thing are bigger skills like flexibility, collaboration, innovation. Those kinds of ways of operating are more important for them to try than to, learn how to build a website. I mean, it's not that hard. You can figure it out. So I moved all of the kind of hard skills to office hours, and then the classes became about these projects. And so that's what we do. And that's what's worked for the most part, is really just having that opportunity to take, I remember this one violinist who had won the Tchaikovsky competition, and taking him to an after-school program for kids that had never heard music, and the teachers had never heard a violinist like that. And when we first walked in, there wasn't a lot of excitement, because they didn't know Curtis and they didn't know what the Tchaikovsky competition was, and it wasn't relevant to them. And the violinist said, "Oh, well, I don't want to play unless people want me here," because he wasn't feeling that sort of comfort that you feel when you walk into a concert hall where everyone's come expecting, a violin concerto. And I said, just hang with it a little bit longer, just stay in. And when they're ready, we're going to start talking to them and we'll start playing. And they finished what they were doing, and he got up, and I said, just play something short that you love. And he played. And as soon as he started playing, the teacher especially sat back and went, whoa, okay, this is worth listening to. And then the kids also really responded to it. And then they started asking him questions, and he answered questions about music that he listened to, not all of which was classical music. And they just had a conversation, and he played some more stuff, and it was great. But he never would have been pushed to do that if, we didn't have this project with this program that I could take him out and just get a little outside of his comfort zone. So it's been a fun endeavor for me. It started when I was a student at Curtis. I started the first outreach program, but that was just my friends and I. Actually, the guys from Time for Three were in the school with me, and we would go out and And it was just going to schools and trying to make a connection with kids. And then over time, when I came back to Curtis to do this curriculum, that's when we expanded it, not just to be for schools, but working in healthcare, working in prisons, and with homeless populations. So it just kind of evolved over time, and I never stopped playing the bass, but the question of what is the future of this field and how are we going to make it mean more to more people was something that always bothered me, and something I needed to work towards. And I would not have been satisfied only playing concerts and not working on those issues. So that's just something that I've felt my whole career.
So interesting. What in so many ways, what an interesting juxtaposition maybe of, you have Curtis but then in the city of Philadelphia, which is just, asking for social entrepreneurship. And so, you have like what again, from an outsider's perspective might seem like it's like this ivory tower of classical music perfection. And then you have this city that's just got all these needs, similar to I used to live in Chicago with, incredibly diverse populations, many of whom classical music would be a new thing for them. And, I look at my wife's training in medicine, and when you do that sort of elite performance training, you're so focused, whether it's in the practice room, perfecting your concertos and your excerpts and spending so much time alone, or people going into medicine, those skills that are the most important skills, really, what you're mentioning, the 21st century sort of skills like flexibility. Like, how do you develop flexibility? Well, it's what you're doing, but that's such a nebulous thing. It's so much easier to get better at playing a D major scale. Not that that's easy, or build a website or a resume. So what are some of the, these are impossible questions, so sorry, but what are some of the biggest hurdles that people seem to have when they start to get out? I'm sure it's not easy for everybody, or probably not easy for most people when they're actually getting out into the public like that. You described that one student. Like, what are some of the things that what are some of the hangups that they have to get over, or what are some of the early, maybe tough discoveries that they have as they're starting to get out into the community?
Well, one of the things is repertoire. And I think that we have to be really creative in our choices in repertoire and be willing to think very broadly about it. Because, for example, if a violinist can only play a solo Bach piece because there's no tuned piano at the venue, we have a problem. And it's not that you can't play Bach. I mean, that's a wonderful part of a program. But if you're going to go to a homeless shelter that doesn't have a piano, you're not going to do an hour-long solo Bach violin recital. It doesn't work. And so thinking about arranging, thinking about other styles of music, being flexible in terms of genre. I mean, the rest of the world is living in sort of a post-genre state. And so I don't think we should cling to the term classical. If anything, in the communities I work in, when you use the classical term, it's a turnoff. So yeah. I had a concert series for 10 years that focused on collaboration and multi-genre and multidisciplinary work. And when I was the curator for that, early on, I had a collaboration between a Russian classical pianist and a jazz singer. And I ran into the jazz singer not long before the show. And she said, yeah, I was telling all my friends about it. I said, I was playing with this amazing classical pianist. She said, but as soon as they heard the word classical, they said, oh, sorry, that's not for me. And we had a terrible turnout. And I thought, oh my God, why did we say classical pianist? Why didn't we say we have this amazing pianist and this amazing singer? And if they had come, they would have had heard some jazz, they would have heard some Rachmaninoff, they would have heard some things that were familiar and some things that were maybe new, and they probably would have been open to it. but they were turned off by those labels in the first place. So when you're picking your repertoire, you have to really consider who's it for and play the best you can of anything. You know, we took a string quartet to a homeless shelter that we've been visiting regularly. And they did, you know, Schubert, but they also did some Stevie Wonder, and they played both equally well, and they were equally loved by the audience. But the other thing about that is that when we go to the shelter, it's always an interactive performance. We don't just play for the guests because, again, it could be this thing that is intimidating or not familiar. And so one thing that's just really simple to do, like we asked for guests to come up and stand behind each member of the string quartet and observe just that one member of the quartet and what their role was in the piece. And then afterwards, we asked them, you know, what did they think? What was the first violinist doing? What role did the violist play? And the guests had great answers. And because we asked them, and they said this to us, because you talk to us and you ask us what we think, it means so much more than if you just played at us. So that's another thing for us to consider. And it's just a skill. So that's what I do at Curtis, is coaching students on those skills. You know, engaging people is not about just, oh, you're an extrovert and you have a great personality, so you'll be fine. Well, that's, again, thinking of the approach of like, it's about you and what you say and how your personality comes across. Some of the best artists I've seen at engaging audiences are introverts and kind of quiet people, because it's not about you. It's about kind of seeing the person in front of you and asking them something and then listening. Mm-hmm. And if we all did a lot more of that, boy, wouldn't the world be even better? So I think that's what is at the heart of this, is empathy.
Did you always sort of have that empathy? Is that something that you've had your entire life, or is that something you developed? Like, if you go back to like Mary in high school, like, has that always kind of been your personality, or?
You know, it's funny. I was in Japan doing work with this kind of topic. And they asked me, you know, well, why do you do this work? Part of it is because, you know, growing up I had a very tough home life. And I think that to a degree, you know, that did increase my empathy. You know, my sister struggled with mental illness and passed away 3 years ago. I think that when you see people and live with people that are really struggling, you know, it does increase your empathy. But I also think that just that's part of why I wanted to be a musician. I really wanted to make connections. And I think that is what leads people to it. It's just sometimes we get on the road and then we're trying so hard to be good that we forget why we got on that road in the first place.
Yeah. Well, I love that you were at Curtis with Renan and the other people at Time for Three. And there are people that I certain, a lot of people think it was like kind of early examples of like incredibly successful, if you want to say classical crossover, however you want to describe them. But I mean, I remember mentioning Iris Orchestra. I remember playing in Iris in like 2002 or 2003 or something with them. And just remember that was like one of the most enjoyable concerts of my life. And boy, you throw a little bluegrass in Memphis, Tennessee, and that crowd, that was like the most partying crowd I could ever see. And just like the joy that they bring. And I've played with them a bunch of times over the years, but it's really what a cool environment to be in school with. What were you and those three guys? Were there a lot of other people that were kind of thinking about getting out of the practice room and getting into the community, or were you kind of like an isolated phenomenon, or what was that like?
I wasn't isolated. Actually, Renan was after me, but I was in school with Nick Kindle and Zach DePew. Mm-hmm. And Jeremy Kurtz and I were graduated the same year. So Jeremy was the bass player, not Renan, who was always playing.
Oh, Oh, yeah.
with Nick. And Jeremy was not focused on orchestra at the time at all. He was focused more on solo playing and bluegrass. And so those guys were doing that. And Johnny Gandelsman, who's in is in Brooklyn Rider and the Knights and plays in Silk Road with Yo-Yo Ma. He was a violinist that I was in school with who had a tremendous capacity to kind of collaborate. I think it's still been a constant evolution of not seeing work in the community as different than the kinds of collaborations you want to do anywhere else. So, for example, I still think that the classical music industry is behind in terms of thinking about artistic programming and community programming. So in general, they're still separated, and there is a hierarchy that our institutions suggest. So they usually the head of artistic programming is structurally in an orchestra at a higher level position than community programming. And I don't think that they are separate things. And I think that the artistic level and the diversity, not just in our audiences, but in our artistic practice, is what we're now dealing with. So, for example, making sure that you have living composers on your program, that you have composers of color, that women composers are on the program. Like, all of these things have to be part of the artistic product and content. And you bring that out in a myriad of venues. So it's all the same pursuit. It's not separate. So what I would say about being in school with guys like Nick Kendall and Johnny Gandelsman is they were really curious artistically and taking some risks. And I see that in our students now too. I think actually in many ways, your students will always be a little ahead of you. And that, they've already adapted. I had a faculty member who was very concerned about recording rights, and that students were gonna not get to keep their money through recording. And then when I actually talked to our composition students about it, they said, "Oh yeah, we know that. we know that's not how we're gonna make our living," and they've sort of already adapted around it. So if you're guiding young musicians, I think the most important thing is not to mentor or guide them from a place of fear. Don't worry for them. It's hard, right? I think, for me, an orchestral position and a permanent orchestral position ended up not really being the thing I wanted, but it did feel the most secure. And so I think, parents and teachers will always kind of operate from this place of trying to protect. And then students and kids will always push. But there has to be a time in a young artist's life where they try new things, and you really shouldn't squelch that, even if you're afraid that it won't turn out. That you're going to be a solo bassist. Well, how many of those are there? But you don't know that they can't do it, and if they have the interest and you can nurture it, you don't know that it won't work. So I think we have to be careful not to give the impression that our students' careers should look like our careers, because 20 years later, the entire world is different, and they're stepping out into a new environment. So we can be role models, but it shouldn't be, well, you should be like me.
Yeah. Well put. And it's interesting. The older I've gotten and the more people I've worked with, the more I've learned to never write anybody off and never write their pursuit off, because it's amazing what people can do, and it's amazing what you can't. Like, I look at Nick Villalobos from Simply 3. They made their living playing cover tunes. Violin, cello, bass. You're not supposed to be able to do that. And then I look at people like Jeremy Kurtz Harris, Chorus, or Jory Herman, who was in San Diego and now in LA Phil. Some people that are both two players, and I can think of a lot of others that are really engaged in their community wherever they've been. I looked at Jory, and I mean, he was the Art of Elan. This group, community engagement's been a huge thing that he's done, and he happened to win an LA Phil position in the process and raise two kids. So like, it's the people that I draw the most inspiration from. Rarely, and many of whom are in orchestras, rarely is the orchestra their only outlet. And I remember talking to my old bass teacher, he just recently retired from the Chicago Symphony, Michael Hovnanian, and he pointed out, he's like, the people that are the most inspired and creative, they've almost always got something outside of the orchestra, out of the box, that really lights their fire.
Yeah, and that's the same with my friends in the Philadelphia Orchestra. I mean, there's so many people in that orchestra that do that job so well, and they play so well in that group. And yet they do many things outside of that group, and that's part of what keeps them fresh and, artistically driven, and like my friend Yumi Kendall, who's assistant principal cello, went and got a master's in positive psychology. And there was a live stream the other night of her talking about, techniques and ways to weather the storm that we're in right now. And when you apply that way of thinking to music, you've got even more to offer. Mm-hmm. We actually had a year-long project at Curtis called The Edge Effect, which came from Yo-Yo Ma talk, where he talks about the place where two ecosystems sit next to each other, like the jungle and the Sahara. At the edge of that is where the most new life forms, and the most diversity of new life forms occurs. And so when you think about, psychology in music, or, beatbox flute playing and classical bass and cello playing, like Project Trio, yep. Like very often those different parts of yourself are what make you most unique and appealing. And so rather than feeling like you have to overly specialize or just focus on one, the intersection of the two might actually be the most interesting thing that you can present to the world. Mm-hmm.
I remember talking to Dianna Gannett several years ago, and she was. I think I asked advice for, people heading into music, maybe teenagers heading into music, and she just said, like, find what makes you fascinated and just chase that. What do you wake up in the morning like most excited about? And you'd be amazed what can happen from that. What can come of that? I like that advice.
Yeah, it's great. One of my friends, Dan McDougall, has just been on fire making a cappella videos, solo bass with multiple parts and arranging, and and he's been a lifelong orchestral player and is absolutely loving this artistic freedom. Mm-hmm. So as constraining as it is right now, it is also an opportunity to try things that you don't have time to do otherwise.
Yeah, and I was just chatting with Renan Meyer about how he's making the best of this time, because it is things you can't control in this world. Coronavirus pandemic, probably one of them. You can help to stop spreading it by staying indoors, right? And as we're recording this, but what can you control? What can you do with that found time? Sure, it's challenging and for a lot of people, like financially devastating, but what also things you can't control at this time right now, and trying to like crystal ball the future is something we're all probably doing a little bit, but what can you do? What can you, whether it's getting on a cappella and making some arrangements, or I know Renan's working on a new piece right now. I'm doing a whole lot more interviews than I was with people that were probably so busy that it would have been hard to connect with. So, I think trying to find the silver lining, and things hey, you've been struggling for practice time? Guess what? You probably got practice time now. What can you do with this time besides going down endless spirals of worry watching the news?
Right. Well, and there's two things. One is that I think with being productive is the acknowledgement that you're not going to feel productive all the time, that we're all on this sort of emotional roller coaster. I was in a Zoom meeting at Curtis, and I was only faculty member on the call, and we were just talking about the students and how this is such an opportunity for them to improve themselves and practice in a focused way that they've never had before. And my reminder was just that not everyone is feeling the same way, and it can change day to day. And that's okay too. Like, if you're not learning a new concerto and putting out a new solo album during this, that's okay, because everyone should get through it best they can. And if there are ways that music could help you, and then even better, also be offered to someone else to help them, great, but accept too that there'll be times when you just don't feel like doing anything.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing to keep in mind, the second point would be that it does feel overwhelming, and it's scary now to think about the future in the arts, but don't give up on it, because the arts will make it through this. And actually what is needed is for everyone to really think about how they want to contribute moving forward. And, there are arts relief funds, and there are people out there, and there are actually a lot of resources out there. Like the Sphinx organization put out a great list of resources for artists. So there are places that are looking to help artists both financially, legally, but it will, be up to us to also help move forward and be as creative as we can in moving the field forward, but to not give up on it. There is going to be a future, and if we work on it, hopefully it'll be even better than before. So we'll work more from a place of empathy and more from a place of giving after this.
Well, again, well put. And Mary, you've been on my to interview list for like a decade easily. And I every time someone recommends somebody to me, I put them down in this spreadsheet, and I have no process or rhyme or reason for like when I get to connect with people. But you're on that spreadsheet many times, so it's great to finally we're chatting, and let's do it again, maybe in person after the pandemic, and we can have a less dire conversation about the arts. We'll have figured out where we're all at. I don't know how to wrap up. I usually ask for, you've given such good advice. Maybe one thing. So a lot of different people listen to this podcast, but a lot of bass parents listen to this podcast. I have a lot of people like, my son or daughter plays bass, and the questions about where to go to school or what to think about or whatever. And we've been talking about all these social entrepreneurship and the projects that you do at Curtis and the skills they develop. And again, sorry for the impossible question, but maybe anything you tell parents or any advice you might have for parents who've got a 15, 16, 17-year-old kid plays bass. Maybe they want to play in an orchestra. Maybe they want to do something in music. They're not sure what. Just anything you might want to share with those folks that would help them frame where their kids are going?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I have 2 kids myself, and they're both string players. I don't know if they'll go into music. They're only 9 and 12 now. But what I would say to parents is it's a great thing for your kids to study, and try not to be too scared because, the workplace has changed for everyone, all fields, not just music. And we are seeing a diversity in work life across fields, not just in music. So for me, I've always had a very diverse portfolio of musical activities that have led to a really rich and meaningful career for me. And it's sort of like financial planning, where you have security and diversity. So I like that idea of thinking about it. And that does not mean that you don't go get an orchestra job. That could be one of the things that you do, but it's not the only thing. And so don't be scared about the numbers per se. I think you have to support your kids through the process of learning music. I would say, don't take out enormous loans for performance degrees. Find a program that your family can afford that will not straddle you with a tremendous amount of debt. But, believe that it will be okay, because, I've been teaching bass for 20 years, and every student that I've ever had that wanted to go into music has, and is living a fulfilling life and supporting themselves in music. And they do that in a variety of ways. And they were not all from, wealthy families. I mean, people really do find a way. So, and if you have questions, go to the school and ask, well, what kind of entrepreneurial skills do you teach? How do you approach this issue of diversity within a career? And if they have a good answer for that, then it's probably going to be a good place for your child. So it's an important question.
That's such a great point. I've had the same experience teaching bass. If I really look at everybody who wanted to do this, everybody, if I look back, has done it. Maybe not the way they thought they were going to do it, but they're doing it. So that opportunity is out there. There are only a limited number of positions, obviously, in the Philadelphia Orchestra or Chicago Symphony or San Francisco Symphony, but that's only part of the giant, field of music. One thing that opened my eyes that I wish everybody could do is going to the NAMM show in Anaheim, California. Over 100,000 people go to this. Probably less than 1% of that show is devoted to classical music. And that show, it made me realize, wow, the world of music is vast. And I have had this whole career in this tiny little channel, in this tiny, and it's incredible what really is out there if you just kind of open those blinders a little bit.
Absolutely. No, it's a great way of thinking about it.
Mary, thanks for taking the time. I appreciate it. I'll get this out as quick as I can, and I'll link up to your Curtis page. Anything else you might want? I just was taking notes here, so I'll link up to a couple of things that we were chatting about. But yeah, I appreciate it.
It's so great to see you. Take care.
I know. Yeah, looking forward to doing this in person sometime. So
I hope so.
Take care, Mary. Have a great rest of your day. Mary, thank you so much for chatting. Folks, thanks for listening. And one of the unique pleasures of doing a podcast is I get to catch up with old friends and acquaintances like Mary, and we get to carve out some time to talk about things that I'd want to be talking about anyway, but in this busy world, even though we're all shut in our home to some degree or other, probably still, we just can't find time, or I certainly can't find time, and a lot of people I know, to have conversations like this. So the podcast, and I've said this a lot, so apologies if you listen to the podcast for a while, but this is a good excuse for me to continue to learn and grow and broaden my horizons and talk to people about interesting topics and put away my devices and all that kind of good stuff. And being able to put it out to you is just an added benefit. So thank you for listening, whether this is your 703rd, maybe this episode's going to be, or 700 and whatever, or your first episode, welcome. Lots more for you at contrabassconversations.com. You can dig into our 13-year archive. Crazy. And check out our blog. We got weekly deep dives on all kinds of topics, from beginner topics to nerdy niche topics, technique book reviews, gear reviews, you name it. We're trying to do it over there. And always new things in store. Got a bunch of cool offerings in the works, developments, projects, even with the pandemic. So much more to share in the future. Contrabass Conversations is produced by Michael Cooper, Steve Hinchey, Trevor Jones, and Mitch Moehring. And Mitch makes a beautiful bass in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. You can learn more at mitchmoehring.com. And thank you to Krista Kopper for archiving and cataloging everything we do here on the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Heath, talking fast here, getting through these outros. And we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.